January 3, 1945, Versailles, France. The conference room at Chef headquarters was thick with tension. Outside, a bitter winter wind whipped through the grounds of the palace where French kings had once ruled. Inside, the leaders of the Western Alliance were on the verge of tearing each other apart. Charles de Gaulle, leader of Free France, sat across from Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander. Winston Churchill had flown in from London despite the dangers of winter travel. The British Prime Minister understood that this meeting could determine the fate of the alliance itself. The subject of this emergency meeting was a single city, Strasbourg. 2 days earlier, over 100,000 German soldiers had smashed into American lines in Alsace. The offensive caught Allied command reeling. They were still fighting the Battle of the Bulge in the Ardennes. Now Hitler had opened a second front, and Eisenhower had made a decision that threatened to tear the Allied coalition apart. He had ordered General Jacob Devers to abandon Strasbourg, to pull the entire 6th Army Group behind the Vosges Mountains, to surrender every inch of ground American and French soldiers had bled to capture just 6 weeks earlier. De Gaulle was furious. Strasbourg was not just a city, it was a symbol. The capital of Alsace-Lorraine, the territory France and Germany had fought over for 1,000 years. In 1871, Germany had seized it after the Franco-Prussian War. In 1919, France had reclaimed it after World War I. In 1940, the Nazis had taken it again. General Philippe Leclerc's 2nd Armored Division had liberated Strasbourg on November 23rd. French soldiers had wept in the streets. The tricolor flew over the cathedral for the first time since 1940. Leclerc had taken an oath years earlier in the African desert that he would not rest until French colors flew over Strasbourg's cathedral. That oath had been fulfilled just 6 weeks ago. Now Eisenhower wanted to hand it back to the Nazis. De Gaulle made his position clear. If American forces withdrew, French forces would defend Strasbourg alone. He would pull his entire army out of Allied command. The Western Alliance would fracture at the worst possible moment. Churchill understood something Eisenhower didn't. This wasn't about military logic. This was about 400,000 French civilians who would face German reprisals for welcoming liberation. This was about a nation's soul. After hours of argument, Eisenhower relented. Strasbourg would be defended. French forces would take over the city. American forces would hold the line. But none of this would have mattered if there had not been a line to hold. Because while Eisenhower panicked, while de Gaulle threatened, while Churchill negotiated, one American general had already decided he would not retreat. He had already positioned his forces to fight. He had already refused orders from his own supreme commander. His name was Jacob Devers, and he was the only general ready for Operation Nordwind. December 16, 1944. The same day German forces launched their massive offensive in the Ardennes, Jacob Devers was in his headquarters in Vittel, France, commanding the 6th Army Group. His force consisted of 2 armies, General Alexander Patch's U.S. 7th Army and General Jean de Lattre de Tassigny's French 1st Army. Together they held the southern end of the Allied line from the Vosges Mountains to the Swiss border. Devers had been fighting since August. His 6th Army Group had landed in southern France during Operation Dragoon and raced 450 miles north in 30 days. They had liberated Marseille, Lyon, and Strasbourg. By November, Devers was standing on the banks of the Rhine River. He was the first Allied commander to reach it. Devers wanted to cross. He had identified a crossing point at Rastatt, north of Strasbourg. German defenses on the far bank were thin. His intelligence officers reported that a quick thrust could establish a bridgehead before the Germans could react. Devers believed this crossing could unhinge the entire German southern front, possibly end the war months earlier. On November 24th, Eisenhower visited Devers' headquarters. Devers laid out his plan. Cross the Rhine now, while the Germans were disorganized. Exploit the opportunity before it vanished. Eisenhower said no. The Supreme Commander wanted all Allied forces to reach the Rhine together, a broad front approach, no single army group racing ahead. Devers was ordered to clear the west bank of the Rhine and eliminate the Colmar Pocket, a German bridgehead south of Strasbourg that still held French territory. Devers was furious. He believed Eisenhower was throwing away a historic opportunity, but he was a soldier. He followed orders. What Devers didn't know was that his obedience would soon be tested in ways he never imagined. When the German Ardennes offensive hit on December 16th, the entire Allied command went into crisis mode. Eisenhower pulled divisions from every sector to reinforce the Bulge. Patton's Third Army turned north to relieve Bastogne, and Devers was ordered to stretch his already thin lines to cover Patton's abandoned front. Suddenly, the Seventh Army was responsible for 126 miles of front. 6 infantry divisions and 2 armored divisions spread across terrain that should have required 12 divisions to defend. Some units were holding sectors 20 miles wide. Standard doctrine said a division should hold no more than 5 miles. Devers knew what this meant. If the Germans attacked his front while he was this exposed, he would be in serious trouble. On December 19th, Eisenhower summoned his commanders to Verdun, the same meeting where Patton made his famous promise to relieve Bastogne in 48 hours. But after that meeting, Eisenhower pulled Devers aside. The Supreme Commander had new intelligence. German forces were massing opposite the Seventh Army. Another offensive was coming, and Eisenhower had a solution: retreat, pull, back from the exposed positions in Alsace. Shorten the lines, give up ground to create reserves. Be prepared to withdraw all the way to the Vosges Mountains if necessary. Devers argued against it. His men had fought hard for that ground. A retreat would devastate morale, and abandoning Strasbourg would be a political catastrophe for France. Eisenhower didn't care. He gave Devers a direct order: prepare contingency plans for withdrawal. Be ready to execute them on short notice. Devers flew back to his headquarters. He called in Patch and his corps commanders. He told them about the threat. He told them about Eisenhower's orders. Then he did something remarkable. He decided to fight. December 24th, 1944. Christmas Eve. While American soldiers in the Ardennes were freezing in foxholes, Devers' intelligence officers delivered a warning. German radio traffic had spiked dramatically in the sectors opposite the Seventh Army. Prisoner interrogations mentioned new units arriving. German patrols were becoming more aggressive. An attack was imminent. Devers had already been preparing. Unlike other commanders who relied solely on chef intelligence, Devers had developed his own network. His G2 staff had been tracking German unit movements for weeks. They had identified at least 17 German divisions massing for an assault, including the 6th SS Mountain Division, the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division, the 21st Panzer Division, and the 25th Panzer Grenadier Division. This was not a local counterattack. This was a major offensive. On December 26th, Devers received a message from Schaeff. The attack would come within days. Allied code breakers had intercepted German communications confirming the offensive. But here was the difference between Devers and other commanders. He didn't wait for permission. He didn't ask for guidance. He acted. Devers ordered Patch to pull back his most exposed units to more defensible terrain. Not all the way to the Vosges, as Eisenhower wanted, but to intermediate positions that could be held with the forces available. He identified the Moder River as his main defensive line. He stripped units from quiet sectors and positioned them as mobile reserves. He ordered newly arriving divisions, the 42nd, 63rd, and 70th Infantry Divisions, to send their infantry regiments forward immediately, without waiting for their full complements to arrive. He organized these regiments into ad hoc task forces under their assistant division commanders. He was creating reserves that didn't exist on paper, finding strength where Schaff saw only weakness. Most importantly, Devers refused to abandon Strasbourg. He shifted his lines so that the French First Army would take responsibility for the city's defense. This kept Strasbourg in Allied hands while freeing American units to face the German attack. It was a calculated gamble. Devers was technically complying with Eisenhower's orders to prepare for withdrawal while actually positioning his forces to stand and fight. If the gamble failed, his career was over. If it succeeded, he might save the entire Southern Front. New Year's Eve, 1944, 11:09 p.m. In frozen foxholes across Alsace, American soldiers waited. There would be no celebrations tonight. General Patch had forbidden them. He did not want Germans attacking hungover troops. The waiting ended at midnight. German artillery opened fire along an 80-mile front. Thousands of shells slammed into American positions. Nebelwerfer rocket launchers, the dreaded screaming Mimis, lit up the night sky. Then came the infantry. Then came the tanks. Operation Nordwind had begun. 3 days earlier, at his military headquarters at Adlerhorst, Hitler had addressed his commanders. "This attack has a very clear objective," he told them, "namely the destruction of the enemy forces. There is not a matter of prestige involved here. It is a matter of destroying and exterminating the enemy forces wherever we find them." 2 German army groups attacked simultaneously. Army Group G, commanded by Generaloberst Johannes Blaskowitz, struck from the north through the low Vosges mountains. Army Group Oberrhein, commanded by Heinrich Himmler himself, attacked from the Colmar Pocket in the south. Himmler had no military experience. He had commanded concentration camps, not combat units. But Hitler trusted him, and Hitler had promised him a prize. Hitler had promised Himmler that the swastika would fly over Strasbourg Cathedral by January 30th. The goal was not merely to recapture territory, it was to destroy the American 7th Army entirely. Then a follow-up operation, codenamed Zahnarzt, would strike into the rear of Patton's Third Army. If successful, the entire Allied southern flank would collapse. The initial assault hit Task Force Heudelson, a scratch force of cavalry squadrons and armored infantry holding the seam between the 15th Corps and 6th Corps. The Germans infiltrated through fog and thick forests without artillery preparation. By morning, they had penetrated 10 miles into American lines. At Wingen-sur-Moder, the 6th SS Mountain Division, veterans of brutal fighting in Finland and Russia, slammed into the 45th Infantry Division. In savage close-quarters combat, the SS troops destroyed an entire battalion of the 157th Infantry Regiment. The town changed hands multiple times. At Bitche, 4 Volksgrenadier divisions pushed through the mountains, threatening to cut the vital road to Strasbourg. By January 5th, the initial German assault had created dangerous salients throughout the American front, but it had not broken through, and now Devers's preparations began to pay off. The mobile reserves he had created plugged gaps as they opened. The 45th Division bent, but did not break at Wingen. The task forces he had formed from newly arrived divisions rushed to threatened sectors. American artillery, pre-positioned on commanding heights, hammered German columns on the narrow mountain roads. The Germans had expected the Americans to crumble. They had calculated that the overextended 7th Army would take at least a week to mount a serious response. Instead, they found an enemy that fought back immediately. January 7th, 1945. The Germans committed their exploitation force. The 21st Panzer Division and 25th Panzer Grenadier Division, held in reserve for the breakthrough that never came, were thrown into battle anyway. They struck south from Wissembourg toward the villages of Hatten and Rittershofen. What followed was one of the most brutal engagements of the entire Western Front. For 2 weeks, German and American soldiers fought street by street, house by house, sometimes room by room. Tanks dueled at point-blank range. German Flampanzers, tanks equipped with flamethrowers, incinerated Maginot Line bunkers with American soldiers still inside. American tank destroyers stalked Panthers through rubble-choked streets. The 79th Infantry Division, veterans of Utah Beach, held Rittershofen. The 14th Armored Division fought in Hatten. By day, the Americans held one end of each village. By night, the Germans held the other. The front line ran through kitchens and cellars. Colonel Hans von Luck, commanding a regiment of the 21st Panzer Division, later wrote that the fighting at Rittershofen was one of the hardest and most costly battles he ever experienced. And von Luck had fought at El Alamein, he had fought at Kursk, he had fought in Normandy. In the cellars beneath the fighting, 1,500 French civilians huddled in the darkness, praying for survival. When the battle finally ended, 90% of both villages had been destroyed. The burned-out hulks of 31 American Shermans, 9 Stuart light tanks, 51 German tanks and assault guns littered the streets and fields. 83 civilians died in Hatten alone. But the Germans had not broken through. January 15th, 1945. The situation had become desperate. The U.S. Sixth Corps was now fighting on 3 sides. German forces had established a bridgehead across the Rhine at Gamsheim, just 10 miles from Strasbourg. Another column was pushing through the Haguenau forest. At Chaef headquarters, Eisenhower was terrified. He saw his worst nightmare materializing. The 7th Army was being encircled. If it collapsed, the Third Army's flank would be exposed. The entire Allied position in Western Europe could unravel. Eisenhower sent another message to Devers. Pull back, now, fall behind the Vosges, give up everything. And once again, Devers refused. He knew something Eisenhower didn't. He knew his men were holding. He knew the German attacks were losing momentum. He knew that every day the 7th Army stood, more reinforcements arrived from the Ardennes, where the Bulge was finally collapsing. Devers shifted his forces again. He pulled the battered 79th Infantry Division and 14th Armored Division out of Hatten and Rittershofen and withdrew them to the Moder River. This was not the retreat Eisenhower wanted. It was a tactical adjustment that shortened the lines while maintaining a solid defensive position. The Moder River became the final stand. Eisenhower, still demanding a full withdrawal, grew furious. He accused Devers of disloyalty. He threatened to relieve him. General Walter Bedell Smith, Eisenhower's chief of staff, called Devers and delivered a blistering message. The Supreme Commander believed Devers was deliberately defying orders. Devers held his ground. He trusted his judgment. He trusted his soldiers. And he trusted Alexander Patch, who was fighting one of the great defensive battles of the war, with almost no recognition. January 25, 1945, the 222nd Infantry Regiment, part of the 42nd Infantry Division, stopped the final German assault at Haguenau. For their stand, they earned the Presidential Unit Citation. That same day, reinforcements from the Ardennes finally arrived. The 101st Airborne Division, fresh from their epic defense of Bastogne, moved into position along the Moder River. Hitler personally ordered Operation Nordwind halted. His last offensive in the west had failed. Strasbourg remained in Allied hands. The 7th Army had not been destroyed. The Third Army's flank was secure. The Western Alliance held together. The cost was terrible. American forces suffered approximately 15,000 casualties, including 3,000 killed. German losses exceeded 23,000. In the bitter fighting of Operation Nordwind, the Sixth Corps alone suffered 14,716 casualties. But the losses would have been catastrophically worse without Devers. If Eisenhower's withdrawal had been executed, the Germans would have recaptured Strasbourg. They would have seized the road junction at Saverne. They would have positioned themselves to strike into the rear of Patton's army. The entire Allied southern front might have collapsed, and 400,000 French civilians in Strasbourg would have faced Nazi reprisals for welcoming liberation. The German radio had already announced that the swastika would fly over Strasbourg Cathedral. Everyone knew what that meant. Instead, French forces held the city. American forces held the motor. The German offensive failed to achieve a single strategic objective. In the weeks that followed, the Allies went back on the offensive. In February, the Colmar pocket was finally eliminated. In March, Operation Undertone cleared northeastern Alsace. On March 26th, Devers's 6th Army Group crossed the Rhine. On May 5, 1945, General Jacob Devers accepted the unconditional surrender of Army Group G, all German forces in southern Germany and Austria. But history remembered Operation Nordwind differently. In the official accounts, it became a footnote to the Battle of the Bulge. The Ardennes offensive received endless attention. Patton's relief of Bastogne became legendary. Nordwind was barely mentioned. Devers never received the recognition he deserved. Eisenhower ranked him 24th out of 38 generals in his post-war evaluations, described Devers as enthusiastic but inaccurate. He gave higher marks to Omar Bradley, who had been completely surprised by the Ardennes offensive, and to Courtney Hodges, who had nearly collapsed during the Bulge. The personal animosity between Eisenhower and Devers dated back years. In 1943, Devers had refused to release bombers to Eisenhower in North Africa. In 1944, he had refused to release Lucien Truscott to work for Bradley. Eisenhower never forgave these slights, but George Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff, understood what Devers had accomplished. On March 8, 1945, Marshall pushed through Devers' promotion to full general, making him the second highest-ranking American officer in Europe after Eisenhower. The promotion was dated ahead of Bradley and Patton, giving Devers seniority over both. Marshall knew what the history books would eventually recognize. When Eisenhower ordered retreat, Devers prepared to fight. When Schaff panicked, Devers stayed calm. When other generals saw only weakness, Devers found strength. Historians are now beginning to reassess Devers's performance. The National World War II Museum calls his handling of Operation Nordwind evidence that he was one of the better field commanders of the war. Military analysts note that he skillfully shifted forces to meet each German assault while navigating the diplomatic minefield between Eisenhower and de Gaulle, but the most telling assessment came from Devers himself. After the war, he wrote in his diary about Eisenhower's withdrawal orders. "You can kill a willing horse by overdoing what you require of him. Schaff has given me too much front and taken away too many of my troops. This is unsound. He was right, but he didn't use that as an excuse. He found a way to win anyway. The WWII Corps commander, General Edward Brooks, fought what Devers called one of the great defensive battles of all times with very little. The soldiers of the 79th Infantry Division held Rittershofen until they were ordered to withdraw. The soldiers of the 42nd Infantry Division stopped the final German assault at Haguenau. The soldiers of the 45th Infantry Division broke the back of the 6th SS Mountain Division at Wingen. They held because Devers put them in position to hold. They fought because Devers refused to let them run. The lessons of Operation Nordwind echo through military history. Intelligence only matters if commanders act on it. Preparation only works if leaders trust their soldiers. Orders from above are not always right. Sometimes the commander on the ground sees what distant headquarters cannot. Devers saw that his army could hold. Eisenhower, looking at maps in Paris, saw only disaster. Devers trusted the men in the foxholes. Eisenhower calculated logistics and worst-case scenarios. Both approaches have their place. But in January 1945, in the frozen forests of Alsace, the right approach was to fight. That's why Devers was the only general ready for Operation Nordwind. Not because he was lucky, not because he was reckless, because when every instinct told his superiors to retreat, he trusted his soldiers to stand. Because when the easy decision was to follow orders, he made the hard decision to fight. And in war, that kind of judgment is everything.